The gate is chained, and the chain is new steel, bright as a knife, and the lock sits in the sun like a little square of authority. Beyond it, the land rolls away in a low, patient swell, mesquite, huisache, cactus pads splayed like hands, until the horizon blurs and you start to understand that distance can be owned. The air tastes of dust and salt and something faintly sweet, crushed grass turning warm. Somewhere out there, a water trough is ringing with flies. Somewhere out there, a calf is bawling for a cow that stepped wrong in a wash and never got back up. And somewhere out there, men are working because men have always worked, because fences don't build themselves and kingdoms do not maintain their edges by prayer. They will tell you, this place is a ranch. They will say it the way people say church, the way they say home. They will say it's tradition. They will say it's heritage. They will say it is American in the same way a river is American. Just there, always was. But you stand at that chain and you can feel the lie in your teeth. A ranch is supposed to be open land and wind and a man and his horse. This is something else. This is acreage so wide it stops being scenery and starts being jurisdiction. About 825,000 acres, near 1,300 square miles, a private weather system fenced in with wire and law and the quiet practiced certainty that no one is coming to make you explain yourself. Listen close, and you can hear the old music they play for tourists and school books. Captain Richard King, the legend goes, a riverboat man with a gambler's grin, won the land on a hand of cards or wrestled it out of the brush with grit and good luck. It's a story told to make empire sound like accident, a tall tale polished until it shines. But empires don't rise on luck alone. They rise on documents, on signatures, on the kind of money that doesn't jingle. In 1853, it begins with a purchase so cheap it feels obscene even now. 500 acres for $300. The following year, another bite. 53,000 acres for $1,800. That's not a frontier miracle. That's a legal transaction made in a world where the border is still wet ink and the people already living on the land are treated like weather, unpleasant, inevitable, and ultimately ignored. And then the land begins to breed land. One tract becomes two become 10. The cattle multiply because cattle do what they do when there is grass and no one with power to stop you. The brand becomes a kind of alphabet burned into hide. Not just ownership, but identity. You can smell it when the iron hits. Hair, skin, smoke, a thin scream swallowed by the wind. And around this enterprise gathers a workforce. Mexican and Tejano families and daymen and riders whose names rarely reach the ledger, but whose sweat soaks every fence post. People would later call them Los Quineños, the king's people, like it was a compliment, like it was belonging. But belonging can be another word for inheritance, and inheritance can be another word for trap. By the time the Civil War comes, the ranch has already learned the first law of American business. Chaos is not the enemy if you are positioned to profit from it. Prices whip back and forth. Cattle that might sell for $2 a head in one season suddenly fetching $11 in another, because men are killing men and armies must eat, and money always finds a way to turn suffering into arithmetic. After the war, there are drives north, long, brutal marches that take around 100 days if weather holds, and raiders don't. In 1869, one tally alone, 48,664 head gathered from an estimated 84,000, a number so large you can hardly picture it, a moving continent of muscle and horn and stink, and behind it the men walking into the dust until their tongues crack. Then the wire comes, barbed wire. Thin and cheap and merciless, it doesn't just mark property. It changes the meaning of the sky. It takes open range and turns it into a remembered myth. In the 1880s, men began cutting those fences at night because they know what the wire really is, a line drawn across a life. They cut it because a cow needs water, because a family needs grazing, because the old world is being strangled in plain sight. And the response is predictable. The state makes fence cutting a felony in January of 1884 because the law in America has a habit of arriving right after the rich man's problem becomes urgent. So this is the smell of it, the truth under the perfume, sun-baked thorn, manure, iron, oil, paper, a private kingdom built not only by cattle and grit, but by contracts, by courts, by politics, by the slow capture of an entire region's future. It will call itself stewardship. It will call itself heritage. But a thing can be beautiful and still be brutal. And the two often travel together in this country like brothers. So here is the question that will haunt everything that follows. When a single enterprise grows large enough to resemble a nation, when it spans hundreds of thousands of acres, controls labor by generations, bends legislation to protect its fences, and outlives its founders by becoming a corporation, does it remain a ranch? Or does it become a government of its own, with the law as a hired hand and the rest of us as trespassers on a continent that was never truly ours? If you're still here, make a pact with me. These long, slow stories are exactly what the algorithm buries, and the only thing that keeps them alive is a crowd that chooses depth on purpose. Subscribe, and we'll keep dragging the real America into the light, patiently, relentlessly, and without apology. They say it began the way Americans prefer their beginnings, clean and bright, and a little bit miraculous. A man with a riverboat captain's hands and a gambler's smile, a deck of cards, a lantern swinging above a table, the land changing owners on a final turn of the wrist, a kingdom won on luck. It makes for a fine story because it makes the taking feel innocent, because it suggests the land was waiting for the right man to claim it, because it turns appetite into destiny. But the truth is colder. The truth is paper. In the early 1850s, the border down here is not a line. It is an argument that keeps being fought with different weapons. The war with Mexico has ended on paper, 1848, but the aftermath is still alive in the brush. Surveyors with chains, lawyers with ledgers. Families who speak Spanish on land that suddenly claims to be American, a country trying to learn what it owns, and a man named Richard King moving through it like a trader moves through a ruined city, eyes open, hands clean, always counting. South Texas is not the postcard yet. It is a hard, flat world that stares back at you. The coastal plain runs rough and low, a place where the sky feels too big and the wind never quite forgives you. Mesquite and huisache, thorn that can tear denim and skin without slowing down. Water in pockets and in seasons. Summer heat that comes early and stays late. The kind that makes a man's shirt cling to his spine as if the fabric is ashamed to let go. There are mosquitoes thick along the low places. There are rattlesnakes coiled in shade. There are days when the air smells like wet earth and days when it smells like nothing at all, like the world has been emptied. And there is land, enormous, unmeasured to the eye, indifferent to the man standing in it. Land that, in this era, can still be purchased the way men purchase a future, not by conquering it with a rifle, but by acquiring the right to say it is yours. In 1853, the first move is almost laughably small compared to what will come. 15,500 acres, an amount that sounds like a number until you try to walk it. Bought for $300, $300, in a time when a decent horse might cost a small fortune and a man could work a year and still never see that kind of money in his hands. A stretch of country large enough to swallow entire towns is signed away for the price of a few wagons. That is the beginning. Not a poker hand, a bargain. And bargains like that do not happen in sunlight. Picture it properly, not the romance of the frontier. A room with a desk worn smooth by elbows and worry. A clerk with ink-stained fingers. The slow turn of a ceiling fan, not to cool the place. Nothing cools a South Texas day in summer, but to keep the air from going stale. The smell of paper, dust, sweat, and tobacco. Outside, the street is bright and pitiless. Inside, the quiet is heavy with consequence. There is a deed. There are descriptions written in a language that tries to turn a living landscape into lines. Creek beds, oaks, fence corners that may not exist yet. There are signatures that will outlive everyone in the room. And there is King, who understands something most men do not, that the cheapest way to win a war is to never fight it at all. He came up hard, a boy who ran away to the sea, who learned discipline and violence from water and machinery. He spent years on the rivers, on steamboats and freight, watching commerce cut through wilderness the way a knife cuts through hide. He learned what moves men: money, hunger, fear. On the Rio Grande, he learned the border's true language, which is not patriotism or flags, but trade. Cotton, hides, sugar, cattle, whiskey, ammunition, anything that can be turned into profit and carried away before the next man arrives with a claim. So when he sees South Texas, he does not see romance. He sees margin. The land he buys is not just grass and brush. It is strategic. It sits in a region where cattle can roam wide and multiply fast, where a few riders can watch a lot of country, where the distance itself is a weapon because it discourages outsiders. It is near watercourses that can keep animals alive through lean times. It is open enough to run herds and remote enough to keep problems away until you're strong enough to handle them. And then, because this is how such things grow, he buys again. In 1854, another purchase, 53,000 acres for $800, still absurdly cheap. Still a fraction of what the land will be worth once it is domesticated by title, by fence, by industry. A second bite taken with the same calm, the same deliberate hand. Not the hand of a gambler chasing luck, but the hand of a man stacking the deck. People will later say the land was empty. It wasn't empty. It was simply unprotected in the ways the new system recognizes. There were people living in and moving through this country, Mexican families, Tejano ranchers, laborers, smallholders, riders, who understood the land not as a commodity, but as a place where you survive. There were old grants and old claims, some clear, some contested, some held together by memory and family testimony. There were also predators, raiders, thieves, men who could take a few hundred head and vanish into the brush like smoke. And there was violence, the kind that doesn't make newspapers because it happens too far from the cities and too close to the truth. So the land is not won. It is assembled, and assembling it requires a certain type of cruelty. Quiet, administrative, patient. The cruelty of the ledger. A man can be displaced without a shot fired. A family can lose a grazing place because they never had the right stamp on the right document at the right moment. A boundary can be moved with a pen. History can be edited in real time. Was it enterprise or was it theft refined into procedure? King's genius, if you want to call it that, is that he recognizes the new age arriving. The old Texas, with its fluid borders and informal agreements, is giving way to a harder world where the law is not a moral force, but a tool. If you can afford attorneys, if you can pay surveyors, if you can ride out to the far corners and mark what you claim, you can turn air into property, and once you own the property, you can turn property into power. Cattle are the first engine. In this country, cattle multiply almost without permission. A handful becomes a herd. A herd becomes wealth that walks on four legs. The open range is a bank account that grazes. But cattle also demand control. They demand riders who can read tracks in dust, who can mend broken tack with wire and prayer, who can ride all day with a mouthful of grit and still sleep on the ground without complaint. They demand a workforce, and right away the workforce begins to form. Men hired because they already know this land, because their fathers knew it, because their Spanish and their horsemanship and their endurance are older than the flag that now claims them. They will become the backbone of what will later be named and celebrated. But in these early years, they are simply hands. They build the first corrals. They dig the first wells. They ride out after strays. They take the first risks that allow a landowner to stay home and remain a landowner. That is the invisible architecture of empire, the labor that does not get written into the myth, because the myth requires a single man. It requires a hero who makes it all happen. Americans like their history like they like their sermons. One figure at the center, virtue and grit, a narrative you can sell. But the reality is a network. Partners, credit, influence, laws bent in quiet rooms, wages paid late, men injured and replaced, land purchased not because it is loved, but because it is vulnerable. King did not create South Texas. He did not tame it. He identified it. He recognized that in the new America, the frontier is not conquered by guns alone. It is conquered by paperwork, by capital, by the ability to wait. And if you want the first true sin, the first stain that never quite washes out, it is this: the empire begins not with bravery, but with opportunity, with a price that should not have been possible, with land acquired in a moment when the people best positioned to defend their claims were the least likely to be heard by the courts that mattered. Was this the birth of a ranch, or the birth of a private state, one that would spend the next century learning how to keep its borders intact without ever appearing to raise an army? Because once those first deeds are signed, once 15 to 500 acres becomes 60 out of 500 in the span of a year, the shape of the future has already changed. The land has been taught a new language, and the language is ownership. They say the ranch was born of partnership. Two men squinting into the sun, a handshake. Shared risk, shared dream. The kind of story Americans like because it sounds fair, because it suggests the empire was a cooperative thing, built in daylight with witnesses. But empires do not like equals for long. And the truth, quiet, documented truth, is that the first great expansion of this kingdom required a vacancy. In 1853, down on the Nueces in the coastal brush country, Richard King does not build with boards and nails. He builds with deeds and fractions. The land is written as Rincon de Santa Gertrudis, 15,500 acres, bought on July 25, 1853, for $300. A number so small it feels like a clerical mistake until you remember what the era considered valuable and who the system was designed to hear? In that same year, King sells Gideon K. Lewis an undivided half-interest, not in a house or a barn, but in a grant, for $2,000. And on November 14, 1853, the partners trade half-interest back and forth like cards across a table. Lewis sells King his half and other ranchos for the same $2,000. Symmetry on the paper that looks clean until you understand what symmetry can hide. This is what the early ranch is, a set of overlapping claims, a braid of titles, a future stitched together out of legal language, undivided interest, perfected title. Terms that sound harmless until you realize they describe power without fences, ownership without presence, control without the nuisance of accountability. The geography does the rest. Santa Gertrudis Creek runs where it runs, not caring who names it. Mesquite thorns snag your sleeves. The sun drags itself across the sky like a slow-burning coal. A man can ride all day and still feel like he has not reached the edge of anything. And in that vastness, partnership feels necessary, because distance is expensive and risk is constant. And the world is still raw enough that a ledger alone won't save you when the wrong men come riding. Lewis is not a footnote. He is a newspaperman, a political animal, a man with connections and a mouth built for argument. He's the kind of partner you choose not for romance, but for leverage. He understands Corpus Christi, understands offices and votes and the machinery of influence. King understands the river and commerce and the cold patience of capital. Together, they have what the frontier rewards, ambition and access. And then, in April of 1855, Lewis is killed. The story that survives is sordid, because America enjoys a moral ending when a man dies. Lewis, the account goes, is shot by the husband of a woman he'd been seeing. It's the kind of tale that makes people nod as if the universe keeps books. But death on the frontier is rarely neat. Death is messy, death is sudden, and death is useful. Because when a partner dies, the ranch doesn't pause to mourn. It moves to acquire. Picture the probate, the inventorying of a life. Horses counted, weapons listed, papers gathered from drawers. An estate administrator stepping into the empty space a dead man leaves behind. The language changes from the heat of the brush to the chill of the courthouse. On July 1st, 1856, there is a court sale of Lewis's property, including that undivided half-interest in the Rincon land. It's summer in South Texas, hot enough that men's collars darken with sweat, and the air in a crowded room takes on the sour smell of damp wool and tobacco. The clerk calls out parcels and numbers in a steady voice, as if reading scripture. Buyers watch with blank faces, not wanting to reveal hunger, and King, who has learned that the cleanest knife is the one you don't hold yourself, arranges for Major W. W. Chapman to bid. Chapman is not a rancher's name. Chapman is a government man, a quartermaster at Fort Brown in Brownsville, a figure who regulates contracts and supply lines, the kind of person who understands how money moves when it's wearing a uniform. He bids and acquires the Rincon interest for $575, a number that sits there, plain and brutal, because it tells you what happens when property meets urgency and death. A half of a grant, the seed of a kingdom, purchased in a proceeding that looks legal enough to satisfy the record, and then the paperwork continues its quiet work. Lewis's estate is handled, deeds executed. The transaction is formalized in 1856, the Lewis interest conveyed for that same $1,575, and the payment is not a sack of coins. It's a promissory note, King's note, Because even here, in the supposed wild, the engine is credit. A man's signature is allowed to substitute for money. Trust becomes currency when you're already powerful. And there's a detail that should make you sit up straight. That deed, the one that fixes the transfer, the one that turns a dead man's share into the living empire's, does not get recorded until 1904. Think about that. Nearly half a century of silence in the public record, half a century where ownership exists, but not in the way the world can easily see. Half a century where disputes can be managed, questions can be answered selectively, taxes can be handled through partners, and the truth can remain pliable. Was it prudence? Or was it concealment disguised as business? And it doesn't stop there. The partners change skins, but the structure remains. King pulls in another name, Captain James Walworth, to acquire the full De la Garza grant, and on December 26, 1856, Walworth pays $5,000 to complete that purchase. The arrangement is simple in its cynicism. King keeps operational control. Walworth holds title quietly and pays the taxes. A silent partner, a shield made of respectability and paperwork. This is the ranch's first clear lesson, learned early and never forgotten. Control and ownership are not always the same thing, and the gap between them can be where empires hide. So forget the handshake. The origin story is not two men sharing a dream. It's one man learning how to survive partners, how to use them, how to outlast them, how to replace them with better instruments. It's a kingdom beginning to understand that it can be built from absence as much as presence. Lewis is dead. The deeds are rearranged. The titles harden. The land stays where it is, indifferent, while the humans above it shuffle paper like priests handling relics, and out on that vast brush country, the real work begins. The riding, the building, the tending, the sweating under a sun that does not care who owns what. Because a man can acquire land with ink, but he cannot hold it with ink alone. So who holds it then? Who rides the fence lines that don't yet exist? Who digs the wells? Who sleeps in the dust? Who becomes, over time, not partners, but possessions in everything but name? The king's people? They call them cowboys in the stories, lone men with a rope and a cigarette and a bad attitude, drifting across open range like they invented motion. They tell it as if the ranch rose out of pure muscle, as if the land looked up one day and decided to cooperate. But the truth is older than the word cowboy, and older than the flag flying over this country. The truth is that the ranch was built by families whose names rarely made it into ledgers, by writers who spoke Spanish and learned horsemanship the way other people learn prayer, early and without choice. The truth is that an empire does not stand on a single man's shoulders. It stands on thousands of backs, year after year, until the work becomes tradition, and tradition becomes a chain you can't see. In the 1850s, South Texas is still half wild and half written. The land is being translated, slowly, imperfectly, from the language of Mexican grants into the language of American deeds. And while lawyers argue over corners and creek beds, the day itself is settled by men who wake before light and go to sleep when their bodies give out. Picture the morning, not romantic, just real. The dark is still holding on, and the stars are sharp, and the air has that brief coolness it offers, like a lie before the sun climbs up and starts pressing. A cook stirs a pot over coals. Coffee black as ditch water, beans, maybe a slab of salt pork if there's been money or luck. Saddles hang on rails, ropes coiled, stiff from sweat and dust. Spurs clink softly when a man walks. small metal sounds in a world that otherwise belongs to insects and wind. The horses are already shifting, ears flicking, impatient, because the horses know. They know there will be hours of brush and heat, thorns scraping hide, the constant need to keep moving. A rider checks a cinch with practiced hands. Another man tightens a rawhide riata. No speeches, no slogans. Men speak in brief phrases because long talk wastes breath, and breath is currency out here. This is what makes a ranch function. Repetition. The same motions done until they don't feel like choices anymore. And that is where the myth breaks down. Because when people say King Ranch, they imagine Richard King himself riding every line, counting every head, wrestling the land into submission with willpower. They forget that in 1853, when 15 to 500 acres are bought for 300, and in 1854, when another 53,000 acres go for 1,800, those acres don't come with fences. They don't come with water systems. They don't come with roads. They come with thorn and distance and the daily reality that land is worthless if you cannot work it. And working it means people. So the ranch begins to gather its human infrastructure the way it gathers cattle, steadily, relentlessly, with the certainty that growth requires bodies. Some of these men are vaqueros, whose families have ridden this country long before it had a new name. Some are laborers from towns along the river and the coast. Some come because there is nowhere else to go, where a man can trade skill for food and a measure of stability. The ranch offers that stability the way a ship offers passage, at a price and on the ship's terms. They build the first corrals, cutting cedar and mesquite, setting posts into hard ground with sweat and curses. They clear brush where brush can be cleared, knowing it will return anyway because the land is stubborn and has its own plans. They dig for water, sometimes finding it, sometimes striking only dust and stone, and when they do find it, that water becomes a point of gravity. Cattle come, people come, a camp becomes a node becomes a system. This is how a private kingdom is made, not by a dramatic conquest, but by logistics done day after day until the land starts behaving like an asset. You want to see the real structure of power? Watch who sleeps where. The owner and his overseer sleep under a roof when there is a roof. The hands sleep closer to the work. They sleep where the cattle are. They sleep where the horses are. They sleep under the open sky with a saddle for a pillow and a coat pulled over their face to keep off the dew and the mosquitoes. Their labor is not just physical, it is constant presence. The ranch owns the land on paper, but these men occupy it with their bodies. And occupancy is what makes ownership real. And over time, a kind of identity forms, part pride, part captivity. The ranch becomes more than an employer. It becomes a world. A child is born on ranch land, grows up watching riders disappear into the brush at sunrise, learns to handle horses before he learns to read, and then, as a young man, rides out himself. A daughter grows up in a household where the ranch dictates the calendar as surely as the church does. Roundups, branding, storms, drought. Life arranged around someone else's property. They will later call these families los quineños, the king's people, as if the phrase is affectionate, as if it means belonging. And maybe it does. In the same way, a prison becomes familiar to a man who has never seen the world outside it. Belonging is complicated when the place you belong to can dismiss you, replace you, or bury you without a headline. If you want the harsh arithmetic of this arrangement, look at the cattle counts, when they start being recorded in earnest. In 1869, King's operation rounds up 48,664 head out of an estimated $84,000. Numbers that big don't happen because a single man is tough. They happen because there is an organized labor force capable of moving a continent of animals across a landscape that will happily kill the unprepared. Every one of those cattle represents hours of riding, roping, dragging, branding, doctoring, and chasing strays through brush thick enough to tear flesh. Every one of those hours belongs to somebody whose name won't be carved into the legend. So ask yourself what the myth is really protecting. It isn't protecting history. It's protecting ownership. It's protecting the idea that wealth is the natural reward of courage rather than the compound interest of other people's lives. Was this a community built by necessity, or was it an early form of enclosure, one vast workplace disguised as homeland, where loyalty is praised because loyalty is cheaper than wages? And then the wider world begins to shift. Rumors come down the coast and up the river. Talk of politics turning hard. Talk of secession. Talk of war. Men who ride all day and sleep on the ground still hear the distant drumbeat of a country preparing to split open. So when the storm finally breaks, when the Civil War comes dragging markets and violence behind it, will it liberate these workers into a different life? Or will it tighten the ranch's grip, turning chaos into profit and people into even more essential machinery? In the spring of 1861, the news arrives the way most news arrives in brush country, late, dust-stained, and already half-turned into rumor. A rider comes in from the coast with a folded paper in his pocket and a horse lathered white at the shoulders. He swings down, legs stiff, and stands there a moment like a man listening for something he can't quite name. The paper is passed hand to hand. Fingers leave smudges. Someone reads aloud in a voice that tries to sound calm. Fort Sumter. Secession. War. Out here the words don't look like cannons. They look like weather. Men glance at the sky as if the clouds might explain it. The cattle stand belly deep in grass that is already turning coarse. Flies stitch patterns over their eyes. A calf stumbles, finds its feet, and keeps going because animals do not have politics, only appetite. But war does not need your consent. By the time Texas throws in, February 1861, the vote, the joining, the flags changing, the ranch is already a machine with one purpose: convert land and labor into cattle and cattle into money. And suddenly, the market that made sense last season is gone. Buyers vanish, credit tightens. The same men who were loud about expansion become careful and silent. In 1861, cattle prices drop so low they feel like mockery. $2 a head in places, the kind of number that makes a man stare at his own herd like it's become a liability. $2 for something that took years to raise, that wandered miles, that survived drought and predators and thieves. $2, and you still have to feed your hands. Picture Richard King with a ledger on his knee in the thin shade of a porch. He is not young now. He has built something real enough that it needs protecting. He scratches figures into the page, and the figures do not soothe him. He has always understood risk, but this is a different kind. Not a storm you can ride out. Not a partner you can outmaneuver. This is a nation tearing itself open, and the shrapnel is going to land everywhere. So the ranch tightens its belt the way every enterprise tightens it when the world turns mean. Wages become harder, perhaps later. Supplies are counted down to the sack. Coffee, flour, salt, each measured like ammunition. A foreman makes lists, saddles that need repair, horses that can't be spared, men who can't be replaced. Out on the line camps, the hands keep riding, because riding is the only way to prevent the herd from dissolving into the horizon. They ride with rifles across their saddles now, not because they want romance, but because hunger makes thieves and war makes hunger. And then, almost as quickly as the collapse, comes the turn. By 1862, cattle are fetching $11 a head in some markets. 11, a number fat with implications. Armies have to eat. Towns have to feed soldiers' families. Beef becomes strategy. The same chaos that starved one man becomes profit for another. It's not morality. It's demand. You can see the change in small things. A merchant shows up again where last year he stayed away. Men who had pretended they were broke suddenly have money for tack and whiskey. Someone rides in with news of contracts, beef for troops, beeves for commissaries, herds promised on paper and delivered in dust. The ranch doesn't celebrate. It adjusts. That's what it does. It turns like a big animal turning to face a new wind. War does something else, too. It rearranges the meaning of distance. The blockade along the Gulf squeezes commerce, and the border becomes a vein. Brownsville, Matamoros. The old river routes King once ran in his steamboat days. He understands them. He understands the way goods slip around restrictions when men are motivated and the state is desperate. Cotton moves out. Hard currency moves in. The kind of money that holds value when governments print promises. And the ranch, sitting in its scrub kingdom, becomes not just a producer of cattle, but a node in a war economy that nobody admits to in polite company. If you want a darker truth, it's this. War doesn't just create demand, it creates permission. A man can justify almost anything when the country is on fire. A deal that would look crooked in peacetime becomes necessary. A land dispute becomes irrelevant because courts are busy and judges are distracted and the armed men are elsewhere. A ranch can expand its reach because the world is too broken to stop it. By the end of the war, 1865, the surrender, the exhausted silence afterward, the ranch's footprint has grown to something like 146,000 acres. 146,000 acres. Not a homestead, not a spread, a domain. And you don't get there by merely enduring. You get there by acquiring when others are forced to sell, by having liquidity when neighbors have only cattle and debt, by understanding that panic is a discount. Somewhere in those same years, a rider brings word of a skirmish far away, and another rider brings word of a price closer to home, and the second rider's news matters more to the ledger. The hands keep working, the children keep being born, the grass keeps growing or not growing depending on rain that does not care about the Confederacy or the Union, and above it all, the ranch learns the lesson that will define it for generations. History is not a moral arc. It is a market. Was it patriotism that kept the operation alive? Or was it simply the ability to treat human catastrophe as an economic cycle? Down in 1861, up in 1862, and always turning toward advantage. And when the shooting finally stops, when soldiers come home to debts and ruined fences and hungry families, when Texas is full of men with empty pockets and surplus cattle, what happens to all that beef with nowhere local to sell? Do you let it rot on the hoof? Or do you push it north on a 100-day trail and turn distance itself into profit? They say the cattle drives were freedom. Men riding under a sky so wide it made laws feel small. They say it was romance. Harmonicas at night, coffee boiling, the long blue line of a herd moving north like a hymn. But the truth of the drive is not romance. It is inventory. It is arithmetic. It is the conversion of living weight into cash and the conversion of men into moving parts. After the war, after 1865, after the uniforms come home dirty and the promises come home unpaid, Texas is full of cattle and short of buyers. The herds have multiplied in the vacuum of chaos. Beef walks around on 4 legs, fattening on grass that costs nothing but distance. And distance is a kind of currency down here, the same distance that kept raiders away, that hid the ranch from trouble, now becomes a trap. You can't eat an economy. You can't pay wages in horn and hide. You need money that folds. So the plan is brutal in its simplicity. You gather the cattle. You push them north. You find the railheads where Eastern money waits like a magnet. You turn the horizon into a business route. It begins before dawn because everything hard begins before dawn. Men move through the camp in near silence. A match flares, brief and delicate, lighting a face, and then leaving it behind again. Coffee goes down scalding because no one has time to let it cool. Saddles are cinched in the dark. Horses breathe clouds into the chill air that will be gone in an hour. You can hear the herd out there, an ocean of bodies shifting, hooves scuffing, horns tapping. A low, restless sound like a storm thinking about forming. A trail boss stands with a notebook or a scrap of paper, counting, not because he enjoys counting, but because a man who doesn't count loses money and then loses authority. Numbers are protection. Numbers are proof. He knows what cattle were worth when the war began, down to $2 a head in 1861, and he knows what they rose to when demand turned savage, $11 a head in 1862, and he knows the lesson hidden in those figures. The animal isn't the value. The market is the value. The animal is just the vessel. Men ride out along the edges of the herd, taking position the way soldiers take position not for glory, but for survival. Drag riders in the rear will swallow dust until their spit turns to mud. Point riders in front will read the land for water and crossings in trouble. Swing riders keep the sides tight, trying to prevent a drift that can unravel everything. You watch them and you realize the drive is a moving fence made of horses and human will. Then the herd starts. At first it is almost gentle, a slow surge, a collective decision. But soon it becomes relentless. Hooves strike the earth in a constant rhythm that shakes the ground. Dust rises in a curtain that turns the world the color of old bone. Cattle smell of heat and fear and manure, and the smell gets into your clothes, into your hair, into your pores. The men cough and keep riding. Their eyes water and stay open anyway. Days become a kind of punishment measured in miles. The sun climbs and presses down. Water becomes a rumor. When they find it, some creek reduced to a string of pools, some river crossing with banks torn up by thousands of hooves, it is chaos. The lead cattle balk. The rear pushes. A horse slips. A man shouts. The herd bunches up, and in that bunching you can feel disaster hovering. Because the drive's great enemy is not Comanche or bandit or storm. The great enemy is panic. A single clap of thunder at the wrong time. A snake startled under hoof. A gunshot somewhere in the dark. Maybe accident, maybe theft. And the herd can turn into a stampede so fast it feels like magic. Thousands of pounds of animal muscle moving as one, not thinking, only fleeing. Men ride like they're chasing a nightmare, trying to bend that blind force into a circle, trying to keep it from scattering into brush country where you'll never find all your money again. At night, they try to sleep, but sleep is thin. Someone stays on watch. Someone keeps the fire small because a big fire spooks cattle. The stars look sharp and indifferent. Men lie on their backs and listen to the herd breathe and shift and murmur, the sound of wealth alive and vulnerable in the dark. They talk in low voices about prices up north, about railheads, about what a steer might bring if the buyers are hungry. But talk doesn't change the fact that tomorrow will be the same. Dust, heat, horns, and the slow grinding forward. They call it 100-day trail because 100 is a number people can hold in their minds. It sounds survivable. It sounds like a journey. But 100 days is not a journey. It is a season stolen from your life. It is 100 mornings of raw throat and stiff legs, and the same horizon refusing to come closer. It is the slow erosion of the body. It is the slow erosion of sentiment. And somewhere behind this ordeal sits the quiet logic of the big ranches, the ones that can afford to play this game. King's operation, already fattened by land and labor, has the scale to absorb loss. A small rancher loses 20 head and feels it like a knife. A large rancher loses 200 and calls it shrinkage. The very size becomes a form of immunity. In 1869, a count is taken that tells you everything about that scale. 48,664 head rounded up out of an estimated $84,000. Think about those numbers until they turn into images. Tens of thousands of animals pushed, sorted, branded, tallied. Tens of thousands of chances for loss. Raiders, stampede, disease, exhaustion. And still, the machine keeps moving. Still, the arithmetic works. Still, the ranch grows. When the herd finally reaches its destination, somewhere the iron rails begin, somewhere buyers wait with clipboards and cash, the romance dies completely. Cattle are pinned. They are inspected like objects. Men argue over weight and condition, over how much dust is hiding how much flesh. Deals are made fast. The animal that lived years on grass becomes a line item. Money changes hands. Debts are paid. New debts are created. A trail crew might get wages or might get a promise or might get nothing but the knowledge that they survived. And the ranch, back in South Texas behind its distance, has done what it needed to do. It has turned space into profit. It has turned the suffering of 100 days into a margin. Was this enterprise? Or was it a moving extraction, labor wrung from men, value wrung from animals, profit funneled back to the people who owned the paper? And once you've learned that the open range can be converted into money on demand, once you've tasted what scale can do, how it can swallow risk and spit out profit, what's the next step for a kingdom that wants not just wealth, but permanence? Do you keep trusting an open world that any hungry man can enter? Or do you start stringing wire across it, turning the horizon itself into a locked door? They say barbed wire brought peace. They say it ended the madness of the open range, ended the drift and the stealing and the endless arguments over whose cow was whose. They say it civilized a brutal country with a simple invention, thin strands of metal and little points like thorns stretched tight between posts. Progress, they call it, order. But order is never neutral. Order has an owner. Out on the South Texas brush, where the wind can sand a man down to bone and the horizon looks like a promise that keeps moving away, the first fences don't feel like peace. They feel like a new kind of violence, quiet, methodical, legal, a violence that doesn't need gunfire because it has paperwork behind it. By the time the wire arrives in earnest, the ranching world has already learned how to live without walls. Cattle drift where water leads them. Men ride long circles, not to keep animals in, but to keep other men out. Ownership is still partly a matter of presence. If you can ride it, work it, defend it, you can claim it. It's messy, and it favors the tough, and it leaves space, sometimes, for the poor to survive along the edges. Then the wire comes, and the edges harden. Barbed wire is patented in 1874, and what that patent really represents is not a clever twist of metal. It represents the moment the frontier becomes a ledger entry. A man can enclose what he cannot patrol. A corporation can claim what no family could ever truly guard. The landscape changes because the economics change. Posts and wire are cheaper than riders, cheap enough that a wealthy operator can lace the prairie with borders the way a spider laces a field with silk. And in Texas, where land is vast and memory is long, that change does not arrive politely. In the early 1880s, fences begin appearing where people have never seen fences, across trails, across watering routes, across places that had functioned like commons for generations. A cow doesn't understand trespassing. A man with hungry children doesn't understand it either, not in his bones. He understands grass. He understands water. He understands winter. And when a fence stands between his herd and survival, the fence becomes a provocation. So the cutters come. They don't come like an army with banners. They come at night. They come in small groups. They come with wire nippers and a kind of grim purpose. The moonlight shines on the metal strands like a thin river, and the barbs catch the light and disappear and catch it again. A man crouches, puts his hand on the wire to steady it, and you can hear the faint metallic groan as it tightens. Then the snip. Clean. Another snip. The wire slackens, sags, opens its mouth. Sometimes they cut because they need to move cattle through. Sometimes they cut because they are furious. Sometimes they cut because cutting itself becomes a message. You are not God. You do not get to draw lines across a living world and call it moral. And sometimes, often enough, cutting is simply theft in a new costume, a way to confuse property boundaries and drive off someone else's stock in the dark. The fence builders respond the way power always responds, with guards, with guns, with politics. A ranch that can afford wire can afford men to watch wire. Riders posted at gates, rifles in saddle scabbards, private enforcement in a public landscape. And when guards aren't enough, the owners go to the legislature because the legislature is another kind of fence, one made of statutes and punishment. By 1883, the damage from fence cutting across Texas is estimated at $20 million, a number so large it stops being a tally of broken posts and becomes a measure of panic. $20 million in a state still learning what it is, $20 million in a cattle economy where fortunes are built on confidence. A fence is not just wire, it is an investment. When the wire keeps getting cut, investors get nervous. Nervous money starts looking for protection, and protection arrives as a law. In January 1884, Texas makes fence cutting a felony, a single act of legislation, cold and direct, taking what had been treated by some like frontier sabotage and elevating it into a crime against the state itself. That's the trick, isn't it? A private asset becomes public order. A rancher's problem becomes everybody's obligation. The language of law and civilization gets wrapped around an economic interest, and suddenly the man with wire has the state behind him. Was this justice, or was it the rich teaching the government to speak on their behalf? Out on the ranches, the change is felt immediately. Men who might have cut wire last year now think twice, because prison is not romantic. Prison is not a story you tell with pride. Prison is a place that swallows years. And so the fence lines hold a little longer. The cutters become more cautious, or they disappear, or they get caught. The open range, the old loose world, begins to die not with a gunshot, but with a courtroom, and the land itself starts to feel different. Wire changes how a man rides. Instead of reading the horizon, he reads corners. Instead of following water, he follows gates. The cattle, too, begin to behave differently, bunched, managed, pressured into patterns. The ranch becomes less a wilderness and more a system. Pastures, boundaries, controlled access, a place where movement is permission, not instinct. It is easy to call this progress if you are the one writing the deed, if you are the one whose cattle will now stay where you want them, if you are the one whose grass will no longer be eaten by a neighbor's hungry herd. But if you are the one on the outside, if your family has grazed a thin living on the margins, relying on open trails and shared water, then the fence is not progress. It is a closing fist. And in that tightening world, a ranch like King's, already massive, already entrenched, finds what it has been seeking all along: permanence. Distance used to protect it. Now wire will protect it too. The kingdom no longer needs to negotiate with the landscape or with the poor. It can simply enclose. It can privatize the horizon. Yet even as the fence lines rise and the state's power begins to lean in the rancher's direction, another force is gathering, the one no wire can stop: time. Because men who build empires still die like everyone else. And when the fences are finally strung tight and the cutters have been threatened into silence, the question shifts from how you defend a kingdom to who inherits it. When the captain who began this machine finally falls, when 1885 arrives and Richard King is gone, does the wire hold without him? Or does the real war begin inside the fence line where no law can easily reach and no outsider can see? They say when the captain died, the ranch went quiet. They say the men tipped their hats. The widow wept, the son stepped forward, and the machinery kept turning like it always had, smooth, respectful, inevitable. They like that version because it makes wealth feel hereditary in the way eye color is hereditary, natural, unquestioned. But the truth is sharper. The truth is that empires don't pass down. They have to be held down. In 1885, Richard King dies, and the land does not mourn him. The mesquite keeps throwing its thorns. The wind keeps worrying the grass down to the dirt. The cattle keep walking slow circles around water. The only thing that changes is the human arrangement. The hands that sign, the eyes that decide, the voice that answers when someone asks, "Who's in charge now?" And the answer is not a son with a hero's posture. It is Henrietta. You can imagine the first days after, not as legend, as logistics. A room with the shutters half closed against the heat. A table crowded with paper, deeds, notes, accounts, letters folded and refolded until the creases turn white. Men coming in with their hats in their hands, faces tight with the careful politeness people use when they're afraid the world is about to change. A foreman reporting losses, cattle dead in a dry draw, fence down in a storm, a horse gone lame and useless, a bookkeeper explaining figures that don't want to add up. Someone asking about wages. Outside, the ranch is still spread out in all directions, too large to see as a whole from any single place, and that vastness becomes the problem. A small farm can be held together by affection. A private kingdom cannot. A private kingdom must be managed the way you manage a war, by supply, discipline, and an unblinking acceptance of cost. People will tell you she was a widow, as if that describes her position. But widow is just the doorway. On the other side is something harder. She becomes the hinge of the empire, the keeper of the papers, the hand that steadies the whole structure while everyone else waits to see if it collapses. And there is a reason she has to be hard, because the world has already changed around them. The open range is dying. The fences are going up. The old violence hasn't vanished. It's simply changed clothes. Only the year before, January of 1884, Texas made fence cutting a felony. That's how fresh the wire war is, how close it still sits in the blood. Men can still remember the sound of nippers in the night, the slackening twang of wire, the sudden stampede of cattle tasting an opening. They can still remember the way law arrived late but heavy, protecting the fence like it was a church wall. So Henrietta inherits not just land and cattle, but a landscape of resentment and hunger and shifting rules. She inherits a world where the state has begun to speak more clearly in favor of the people who own. But she also inherits the consequence of that favor. Everyone outside the fence line knows exactly who the winners are. And then there's the arithmetic. Think about what it means to operate at this scale in the 1880s. The ranch's origins: 1,500 acres for $300 in 1853, another 53,000 acres for $1,800 in 1854. Those numbers are almost obscene now, not because they were mythical, but because they were real. Cheap land, cheap entry. A foundation laid before the world understood what it was worth. Now the worth is understood. Now there are eyes on it, creditors, county officials, neighbors who want a piece, relatives who can smell inheritance like dogs smell blood, and somewhere in the middle of all that sits a woman who has to keep the thing from being carved up. There's a moment, there's always a moment, when someone suggests selling. Maybe it's a lawyer in a stiff collar speaking gently, as if gentleness could soften what he's proposing. Maybe it's a family member with worry in their eyes and greed behind it. Maybe it's just the voice of practicality. Sell some land, reduce risk, make the books clean again. But the ranch is not a book. It's a living organism. If you cut too deep, it dies. Henrietta understands that. She understands that the real power of the place is not any single pasture or any single herd. The power is continuity. The power is that the ranch as an entity can outlast drought, can outlast bad markets, can outlast men. To keep that continuity, you don't just manage cattle, you manage people. She has to hold the invisible workforce together, too. The riders and families who live on the land, who have made a life inside the ranch's boundaries. You cannot replace that knowledge easily. Not the knowledge of where water hides in a dry year, not the knowledge of how to move cattle through brush without losing half of them, not the knowledge of the land's moods. If those people leave, the ranch becomes paper again, owned, but not truly controlled. So she makes decisions that don't look romantic, but keep the machine running. She keeps foremen loyal. She keeps wages moving when she can. She keeps supplies coming. She settles disputes before they become fires. She listens to numbers the way other people listen to prayer. She learns If she doesn't already know, that power is mostly maintenance. And maintenance has its own cruelty. It means saying no when a man asks for time off because a child is sick. It means denying a request for extra rations because the books are tight. It means letting someone go because sentiment is expensive and a ranch is not built on sentiment. It means understanding coldly that the ranch can't afford softness unless softness buys stability. The myth says the widow becomes a symbol, grief turned into grace, a woman preserving her husband's dream. The reality is more American than that. She becomes management. She becomes the state inside the state. She becomes the one who decides whether a family stays on a piece of land or is told to pack up and vanish into the wider world. She becomes, in a quiet way, the law. And she has time, more time than almost anyone expects. She outlives him by decades, carrying the ranch forward until 1925, long enough to watch the country change skins, from horse to rail, from frontier barter to corporate ledgers, from men settling disputes with guns to men settling disputes with courts. And the ranch, under her watch, cannot remain merely a distant fortress of wire and cattle. Distance protects you, yes, but distance also isolates you. It makes it harder to bring in money, harder to attract influence, harder to anchor your power in something that looks public and respectable. So what does a ruler do when the kingdom is too large to hide and too valuable to leave vulnerable? Does she keep it sealed behind the fence line? Or does she begin building a town, summoning a railroad, and turning private control into public reality? They say towns are born the way campfires are born. Somebody stops long enough, strikes a match, and the rest of the world gathers for warmth. They say a settlement rises because the land is good, because people are hopeful, because the frontier always needs another porch and another church. But towns like this one do not just happen. They are made, planned, measured, pushed into the ground like stakes, and the reason is simple. A kingdom that sprawls across 825,000 acres can hide behind distance for only so long. Distance keeps trouble out, yes. It also keeps money away. It keeps influence away. It keeps your name confined to the brush, where only riders and thieves and the occasional tax man can reach it. A private empire eventually learns the same lesson every empire learns. You don't just defend your borders. You build a capital. So in the early years of the 20th century, 1903, 1904, out in the coastal plain where the heat sits heavy and the mesquite shadows look like ink spilled on dirt, the ranch begins to do something that feels almost unnatural for a place built on open space. It begins to draw straight lines. Surveyors come first, men with chains and tripods and notebooks. They walk the land with an odd kind of authority, pointing at emptiness and calling it Main Street. Before there is a single board nailed down, they hammer stakes into the soil and flag them with scraps of cloth that flutter in the wind like small surrendered banners. They argue over angles. They scratch notes. They talk in the language of property, lots, blocks, right away. They turn a landscape that has always resisted control into a grid, because grids are how money likes to live. You can picture it if you slow down enough. A wagon creaks over caliche. A teamster wipes sweat from his eyes with the back of his hand, leaving a dark streak of dust and salt. A man in a stiff shirt, too stiff for this heat, stands with a rolled map under his arm. His boots are already turning the color of the earth. He is trying not to look like he's suffering, because suffering makes you look weak, and weakness makes you pay more for everything. There are ranch representatives nearby, men who speak softly but do not ask permission. They have the calm posture of people who own what they are standing on. They talk about rail lines the way other people talk about rainfall. They know the value of a whistle in the distance. They know what iron tracks do to land prices. They know that a railroad does not just bring commerce. It brings legitimacy. It brings a public face. Because once a railroad runs through your country stops being merely yours. Railroad men arrive with their own kind of hunger. They are not romantics either. They are accountants with calluses. They look at the ranch's vastness and see freight. Cattle shipped instead of driven. Supplies delivered on schedule instead of by wagon and luck. A direct artery to markets that don't care how far south you are as long as you can deliver on time. And the bargaining begins. It is never a single dramatic handshake. It is meetings, letters, promises that are deliberately vague. Land offered or made available in ways that can be described later as generosity or strategy, depending on who is telling the story. The ranch has something the railroad wants: space, control, the ability to smooth over problems. The railroad has something the ranch wants: access to the nation's bloodstream. So the town site appears as the visible compromise. The first structures are practical, almost ashamed of themselves. A store that sells flour and nails and kerosene. A saloon that pretends to be respectable until the sun goes down. A boarding house where men sleep in rooms that smell of sweat and damp wood. A blacksmith shop, because iron always follows iron. And then, after that, the showpieces. A church, a school, maybe an office with clean windows, because a town is not just a place to buy things. It is a place to appear civilized. Sunday clothes, that's what it is, a settlement dressed up to be seen. But underneath, the old order remains. The ranch still owns the surrounding land like an ocean owns the shore. The hands who live and work under the ranch's shadow do not suddenly become equal citizens because a new street has a name. They become at best consumers, renters, workers who can now be paid in cash that can now be spent in stores that now exist. This is the quiet genius of it. The same labor that built the ranch can now be cycled back into the ranch's orbit through commerce. The kingdom doesn't just control pasture. It begins to control the economy of daily life. Then the tracks finally come. You can hear them before you see them. Hammers ringing on metal, the clank of spikes, the shouted cadence of crews. The smell changes. Creosote, coal smoke, fresh-cut timber. Men in work clothes move with a relentless rhythm, laying down a path that cannot be easily undone. A railroad is a promise made out of steel, and once it's laid, everyone has to live with it. And on July 4th, 1904, the first train arrives. Of course it's that day. Of course it's wrapped in the language of celebration, a nation's birthday used as a ribbon for a private transaction. People gather. Someone makes a speech. Children stare as the locomotive appears, black and massive, breathing smoke like a living furnace. The whistle cuts the air, and the sound travels across the flat country and bounces off nothing, because there is nothing high enough to stop it. It sounds like announcement. It sounds like arrival. It sounds like a future being nailed into place. The train does not care about speeches. It comes for freight. It comes for schedules. It comes for profit. But the people watching Ranchmen, townspeople, workers, merchants feel something shift in their bones. The kingdom, which once relied on distance and fences, now has a corridor. Now it has a spine. And this is where the story gets darker, not brighter, because a railroad and a town don't just bring opportunity, they bring scrutiny. They bring new forms of pressure. Records become more formal. Taxes become harder to evade. Land becomes easier to appraise, easier to covet, easier to litigate. A town creates a stage, and a stage attracts spectators. Bankers, politicians, speculators, rivals. The ranch is no longer merely a private world with a locked gate. It is now a public landmark. Was this progress, or was it exposure? You can feel the tension in the way power behaves once it has a spotlight on it. The ranch must appear benevolent, stable, civic-minded. It must sponsor, donate, smile for photographs. It must speak the language of community while maintaining the mathematics of control. A town is a mask, but masks must be maintained. Masks cost money. Masks require constant adjustment. And all the while, time is still moving, slow and pitiless, because no matter how many tracks you lay, no matter how polished the town looks in Sunday clothes, the ranch is still at its core an inheritance, land held by a family, carried through generations like a burden disguised as privilege. And inheritances do not pass cleanly when they become too large to be personal. So when the old matriarch finally nears the end of her long hold, when the estate's weight begins to loom in the form of taxes, heirs, and the state's hungry hand, does this town and its railroad save the kingdom by modernizing it, or does modernization simply make it easier to carve the kingdom into pieces? They say great fortunes pass like heirlooms, a ring, a watch, a deed folded neatly and handed across a dining table. They say blood takes care of blood. They say the old matriarch closes her eyes and the kingdom simply keeps breathing. But the truth is that a fortune this size doesn't get inherited. It gets audited. In 1925, when Henrietta King dies, after holding the whole apparatus together longer than most men can hold a grudge, the ranch is no longer just land and cattle and distance. It is a structure of claims and payrolls and obligations. It is a world that has learned to survive by becoming complicated. And when the woman at the center is gone, the complication is what steps forward first. There is a morning after the funeral when the ranch still looks the same from the outside. The brush still catches the wind. The cattle still go down to water slow and heavy as if nothing has happened. But inside the offices, inside the rooms where the fan turns and papers stack, everything is suddenly alive with a different kind of movement. Quiet men in dark coats arrive with satchels, lawyers, accountants, executors, people who don't smell like horses, people who believe the world can be reduced to columns. A ranch hand can tell you how many head are missing just by looking at the way the herd holds itself. These men need numbers written down. They begin the inventory the way you inventory any empire, by pretending it is a simple list. Land first. How do you list land you cannot see in one gaze? You talk about it in acres because acres are the only way to make it fit on paper. And by now the ranch has grown into something almost absurd at its largest extent. About 1.2 million acres, a spread so large it stops sounding like property and starts sounding like a province. The appraisers travel through it like missionaries through a foreign country, taking notes, asking questions, measuring fences, inspecting water systems, looking at grass as if Grass is a number. Then the cattle. Counting cattle is not like counting coins. Cattle move. Cattle die. Cattle disappear into brush and reappear somewhere else with a different brand burned onto them if someone has been bold enough. Men ride out with tally sheets. Dust rises. Horses sweat. A foreman calls out numbers while another man scratches them down, and the pencil lid breaks, and somebody curses softly because even the act of counting feels like an insult to the scale of the thing. Then the equipment, saddles, wagons, windmills, wire, corrals, the infrastructure that makes the ranch a machine instead of a dream. It all gets priced. And while they price it, the government waits. This is the part the myth never lingers on. The myth likes the funeral. The myth likes the mourning. The myth does not like the tax bill, because by the 1920s, the modern state has grown teeth. The old frontier habit of living far away and answering to no one has become harder to maintain. Paper finds you now. And when you have a fortune measured in hundreds of thousands of acres, paper finds you with appetite. The heirs, children, grandchildren, names carrying the king line forward, discover quickly that what looks like wealth from the outside can feel like a trap from the inside. Land rich does not always mean cash rich. You cannot easily sell a fence line and keep the ranch intact. You cannot carve out a pasture here and a pasture there without weakening the whole body. Yet the costs arrive in cash terms. Taxes, wages, supplies, repairs, lawyers' fees, the endless, slow bleeding of maintenance, and the world is not kind to ranchers in this era. The 1920s are not all jazz and champagne in the cities. Out here, the ranch economy is still tied to prices that swing with distant markets. Beef can be strong one season and punishing the next. Rain can bless you, then abandon you. A drought doesn't just kill grass, it kills plans. And as the decade turns toward 1929, toward collapse, the wider American economy begins to tighten like a fist. When the crash hits, it doesn't arrive on horseback. It arrives as silence. Orders shrink. Credit gets cautious. Banks start looking at borrowers the way a man looks at a horse he suspects might throw him. The ranch, enormous and famous, is still vulnerable to the basic truth of business. You can be rich and still be forced to sell if you can't meet the demands of the moment. So the family begins to argue, quietly at first, then harder. There are meetings in rooms where the windows are shut against heat and the air tastes of ink and sweat. A man points at a ledger and says the word liquidity, like it is a prayer. Someone else says heritage, like it is a weapon. Someone suggests selling off portions, just enough to satisfy the state, just enough to pay down obligations, just enough to breathe. Someone else understands what selling means. Once you start cutting, you may not stop. Predators circle. Buyers smell vulnerability. And behind all this is a simple, brutal fact. The ranch is no longer just a family possession. It is a public-scale enterprise being held in private hands. That mismatch, private control, public-scale value, creates pressure from every direction. The solution, when it comes, is not romantic. It is corporate. In 1934, Alice King Clayburgh, Henrietta's daughter, hardened by years of holding the line, helps consolidate much of the ranch into a corporation, with her children as stockholders. It is a transformation in legal clothing, a new skin pulled over an old body. Shares replace inheritance in the crude old sense. Governance replaces family impulse. The ranch becomes something you can manage with bylaws and boards and controlled succession, because Uncontrolled succession is how empires die. But even that move is not salvation. It is containment. It is a way to survive the state, survive the market, survive the weakness that comes when a family grows larger than the fortune can comfortably feed. And still, after all the paper is signed and all the meetings are endured, the ranch faces the same hard problem it has always faced. The grass pays what the grass can pay, and the world demands more than grass can promise. There are years when cattle alone are not enough to satisfy the modern hunger for cash, taxes, debt, expansion, stability, the costs of being large. So if cattle and land can no longer carry the full weight of this kingdom's future, what do you do when you begin to suspect the real fortune was never in the grass at all, but in the dark wealth sleeping under it? They say the ranch was built on cattle. They say it lived and died by grass and rain and the hard math of beef. They say the men who ran it could look at a sky the color of tin and know whether they'd be rich or ruined by the time the season turned. That's the legend, because it flatters the frontier. It keeps the story pure. But the truth, like most truths in America, is buried. And once you find it, you stop pretending the grass was ever the whole story. On September 26, 1933, the air down in South Texas still carries that depression dryness. Dust in the corners, worry in the voices, a kind of quiet caution in the way men move when they don't know what tomorrow will cost. In an office not far from the ranch's spine, paper stacked, blinds drawn against the heat, someone lays out a document with a neat header and language so polite it almost hides its intent. A petroleum lease. It isn't signed with spectacle. There is no choir, no flags. Just men with careful expressions and a woman or two who understand that a signature is a door you can't always close again. Ink touches paper. The pen scratches. A name becomes a commitment. Outside, the wind moves through mesquite like a whisper that doesn't care about contracts. You have to understand what that lease is in human terms. It is a confession that cattle alone won't carry a kingdom into the modern age. The ranch has already survived inheritance and taxes and the slow tightening of the state's grip. It has already learned to wear corporate clothing. 1934, the family consolidating the operation into a corporation, shares replacing the old messy romance of mine. But even a corporation bleeds if its only bloodstream is grass. Cattle prices swing. Droughts come like judgments. Payroll doesn't wait for rain. Oil? Oil is different. Oil is the kind of wealth that doesn't need seasons. And yet it begins as a gamble. Because in 1933, oil is not yet a certainty under every acre you dream about. Men have theories. They have maps with lines and guesses. They have talk, always talk, about what lies below. But talk doesn't drill a hole. Talk doesn't raise a derrick. Talk doesn't pay the crew. So when the first prospectors arrive in earnest, they look almost out of place against the old ranch world. Their boots are wrong for brush. Their hands are used to tools that bite steel, not rope. They bring machinery that makes the earth sound different, clanking, hammering, a mechanical insistence that doesn't belong to cattle country. A drilling site is not subtle. It announces itself. Timbers, cable, a tower rising against the flat horizon like a church built for a stranger god. Men shouting measurements, the smell of grease and sweat, and that peculiar sharp stink of fuel. Trucks grinding over caliche, the ground torn up, scarred, reshaped into a work zone that looks temporary until you realize temporary things are how permanent change begins. The ranch hands watch, some with curiosity, some with suspicion, some with the tired acceptance of people who have seen new worlds arrive before. Barbed wire, the railroad, the corporate office. They know what change feels like, even if they don't know what it will cost them this time. Because oil does not just add money. Oil rearranges power. It brings outsiders, engineers, geologists, leasemen, speculators, people who don't answer to the ranch's old hierarchy. It brings a second economy that can pay more than cattle work can pay. It brings noise, light at night, men awake at hours ranchers used to reserve for sleep. It brings a different kind of risk: explosions, blowouts, poison gas, accidents that kill fast and without romance. And still, for a long while, the drilling is just drilling. Days pass, bits grind rock, mud circulates, men wipe their faces and keep working. A crewman spits, and the spit turns to paste before it hits the dirt. You can feel the impatience building the way you feel heat build in a closed room. Then, in 1939, a successful well. There are moments when a place changes in a single breath. This is one of them. When oil finally comes, it does not come politely. It comes with force. It comes black and stinking and alive, the earth coughing up something it has held for ages. Men shout not because they are joyful, though some are, but because shouting is what you do. When the world suddenly becomes dangerous, valves are turned, pressure is fought. The air fills with that heavy petroleum odor that clings to your throat and your clothes. For a moment, it feels like the ground itself has become a living thing, and the men around it are just trying to keep it from bucking them off. Somebody laughs. Somebody crosses himself. Somebody starts calculating. Because a producing well is not just a miracle, it's a revenue stream. It is cash that arrives without waiting for calves to grow or grass to recover. It is the chance to pay taxes without selling land. It is the chance to keep the kingdom intact when the modern world keeps inventing new ways to carve it up. And then the war comes, and with the war comes a hunger that only oil can satisfy. By 1945, when the fighting finally ends overseas and the country turns its enormous machinery back toward civilian life, the drilling accelerates. The ranch is no longer simply a cattle empire with an oil experiment on the side. It becomes a landscape of overlapping purposes: pasture above, petroleum below, two economies occupying the same ground like rival spirits. You can feel that shift in how decisions are made. A pasture that once mattered for grazing now matters for access roads. A water source that once mattered for cattle now matters for drilling operations. Quiet stretches of land become strategic locations. The ranch's old language, herd health, grass condition, rainfall, begins to share space with a new vocabulary: leases, royalties, production, pressure, and the money that flows from below does what money always does. It changes what a person believes is possible. It funds improvements, it funds expansion, it funds the polishing of the ranch's public face. It also tempts the people in charge to believe they can engineer their way out of nature's limits. But oil has a dark humor. It makes you feel invincible right up until it reminds you that it is finite, that it is volatile, that it can spoil a place as easily as it can save it. A kingdom that feeds from oil starts to depend on oil, and dependence is just another kind of fence. So, here's the turn of the knife. Once you've secured a second crown beneath the grass, once the ranch is no longer merely surviving but accumulating, what do you do with that power? Do you keep ranching the old way, trusting tradition and weather and instinct? Or do you start reshaping the land and the livestock themselves, turning a working ranch into a controlled experiment, a laboratory of profit, where even nature has to answer to management? They say ranching is instinct. A man squints at the horizon and knows what the weather will do. He runs his hand along a steer's flank and tells you its worth the way a preacher tells you your sins. They say it's all gut feel and grit, and the old ways passed down like a knife. But the truth, by the middle of the 20th century, is that the old ranch is quietly dead, and in its place stands something colder, a laboratory spread across roughly 825,000 acres, where nature is no longer endured. Nature is redesigned. It's morning at Santa Gertrudis, and the light comes up slow, pale at first, then turning hard and white as it clears the brush. The air smells like damp earth where the night held on, and then the heat starts climbing, taking that moisture back. A line of cattle moves through a chute built of stout posts and steel gates, funneled narrow, because even a 1,000-pound animal can be made to behave if you give it no other option. Men stand along the rail, not the old picture of cowboys leaning easy, singing to themselves. These men hold clipboards. They carry pencils behind their ears. Their shirts are already darkening under the arms. One of them has a scale ticket pad, tearing off thin slips of paper like receipts from a store. A steer steps onto the platform scale, and the metal groans, and the needle trembles, and somebody calls out a number. Another man writes it down without looking up, the way you write down a debt you know will be collected. The cattle don't know they're being measured for history. They only know the press of bodies behind them, the sting of flies, the hard smell of fear trapped in a narrow lane. Ahead, the gate opens. Behind, it closes. They move because the world has been arranged so moving is the only remaining choice. This is the new order. Control, repeated until it becomes normal. The ranch had always controlled space, through distance, through fences, through law. But now it begins controlling biology, because oil money changes what a ranch believes it can afford, and a corporation, papered up, structured, protected, begins to think in terms of systems instead of seasons. A bad rain year is still a threat, yes, but it's a threat you can manage with wells, with cross-fencing, with pasture rotation, with feed strategies that treat grass like inventory. And if you can manage grass like inventory, why not manage cattle the same way? So they start with separation. Cross fences cut the land into decisions. Pastures become units. Water points become levers. Where cattle once wandered according to hunger and weather, now they are moved according to plan. Gates swing open and shut like punctuation. A herd is held here until the grass is grazed to the right height, then pushed there, then held again. The landscape is turned into a schedule. Somewhere out on that immense spread, a crew is clearing brush, dragging chain and steel through mesquite thickets, ripping out what doesn't serve the plan. The noise is ugly. The land protests. Roots tear. Dust rises in sheets. Men wipe their faces and keep pulling, because this is what improvement looks like when you do it to a living place. It looks like force. And in the center of it, quiet, administrative, relentless, is the breeding program. Not breeding in the old sense, where a rancher keeps a bull because his father kept that bull's father and it feels right. This is breeding as design, breeding as manufacturing. The ranch begins selecting animals the way a factory selects parts: heat, tolerance, mothering ability, rate of gain, hide thickness, temperament that won't turn a chute into a slaughterhouse. They keep records and cull hard. A calf that doesn't meet the standard becomes a number that vanishes. The myth says ranchers love their cattle. Some do. But love is expensive, and this operation is not built on expensive emotions. It is built on outcomes. By 1940, the ranch's signature animal becomes official. Santa Gertrudis, recognized as a breed, a name taken from the land itself, an act as bold as it is revealing. The ranch doesn't just produce cattle anymore. It produces a proprietary creature, a living trademark bred to thrive in heat and brush and long distances, bred to turn harsh country into consistent weight. Imagine the pride in that moment, and imagine the quiet ugliness underneath it. A man in a clean shirt, clean because he works closer to the office than to the herd, holds papers that state what the ranch has accomplished: recognition, legitimacy, a stamp from the wider world that says, this is real, not just a local experiment, not just a rancher's brag, a breed, something that can be marketed, exported, replicated. But a breed is also a boundary. It separates what counts from what doesn't. It assigns value to bloodlines the way deeds assign value to soil. It creates winners and losers inside the herd itself. And the losers don't get pensions. They get sold, they get slaughtered, they get erased. Out in the pens, you can see the human side of this transformation too. The hands, many of them from families that have worked this place for generations, learn new routines. They learn to move cattle through chutes without bruising them, because bruising is money left on the table. They learn to tag calves, record numbers, follow protocols they didn't invent. They become skilled in a new way, not just riders and ropers, but technicians in a vast biological machine. And still, for all the talk of progress, the old costs remain. A misstep in a chute can break a leg. A spooked cow can crush a man against a rail. Heat can drop you where you stand if you forget to drink. The rancher's modern brain does not remove the body's vulnerability. It just asks more of it. This is what scientific ranching really means. It means the ranch has decided that nature is not a partner. Nature is a raw material. And once you've made that decision, it spreads. You start treating everything as something that can be optimized. The land becomes a graph. The herd becomes a spreadsheet. The people become labor units, names, yes, but also shifts and costs and replacement timelines. You don't say it out loud. You don't have to. The system says it for you. You can hear the contradiction in the way the ranch speaks about itself during this era. It still sells the myth: hard men, open land, tradition. But inside the fence line, the work is becoming something else entirely: controlled inputs and measured outputs, a private institution behaving like an industrial enterprise wearing a cowboy hat. And that's the dangerous part, the part that doesn't feel dangerous until it's too late. Because once you can manufacture nature and stamp your identity into an animal recognized in 1940, once you can manage a kingdom of 825,000 acres with systems instead of stories, what stops you from realizing the most profitable thing you own isn't the land or the cattle at all, but the name? They say the frontier ended. They say the fences went up and the cattle drives went quiet and the last wild men rode off into the sunset and America became an office with air conditioning and fluorescent light. They say the big ranches survived because they were tougher, smarter, more authentic than the rest. But the truth is that the frontier didn't end. It moved indoors. It put on a tie. And the same old question kept breathing under the carpet. Who gets to own the horizon, and who gets told where the horizon stops? By the late 20th century, the King Ranch is no longer just a ranch, and it isn't only an oil story either. It's an organism with multiple hearts beating out of sync. Cattle still matter, always will, because a ranch without cattle is just a land holding with nostalgia. But cattle are no longer enough to justify the scale. Oil is fickle, too. Oil makes you feel immortal, right up until the market decides you're mortal. There are years when the price of crude is a hymn, and years when it is a funeral bell. You can build a budget on optimism and watch it collapse in a season. You can drill and still find the world has moved on to different appetites. And when that happens, the ranch faces the same crisis it has faced since 1853. Since 15,500 acres were bought for $300, and someone realized paper could conquer what rifles couldn't. How do you keep a kingdom intact when the era that created it has died? The crisis isn't one dramatic shootout at the gate. It's a slow squeezing, a tightening of definitions. The modern world has a way of shrinking old empires without ever admitting it's doing so. Taxes don't come with banners, they come with envelopes. Regulation doesn't arrive on horseback. It arrives as forms, as inspectors, as new words for old things. Wetlands, habitat, compliance, liability. In the old days, distance was protection. In the new days, distance is a logistics cost. You can own 825,000 acres and still be forced to explain what you do with every inch of it, because the state has learned to count. And the family, because it is still a family, even when it wears corporate clothing, does what families do when the pressure rises. It argues, it divides, it negotiates in rooms where the air feels too cold because the air conditioning is overcompensating for a Texas heat it can't truly defeat. People speak softly and smile and use phrases like stewardship and legacy, while the real conversation is about control. Who votes, who signs, who decides when a piece is sold, who gets paid, who gets to keep the myth intact. This is the part the legend avoids. The legend prefers a single founder, a single matriarch, a line of noble heirs. But a corporation is not noble. A corporation is hungry. It needs revenue streams. It needs insulation from risk. It needs a public story that keeps the public from asking too many questions. And the public, by now, has questions. A ranch of this size has always had an aura, too big, too old, too far away. People talk about it like a mythic animal. But myths become targets when the world starts feeling unfair. In a century of layoffs, bankruptcies, farms swallowed by lenders, towns hollowed out by distant investors, the idea of a private kingdom sitting behind locked gates begins to look less like heritage and more like provocation. So the ranch does what any intelligent empire does when it senses the mood turning. It reinvents itself without admitting it's doing so. It starts selling the story, not the full story. The dust and the debt and the workers whose grandfathers died without leaving a line in any book. Not the story of land assembled in 1853 and 1854 at prices that now sound like a sin. Not the story of fences protected by a felony law in January 1884 when the state decided wire mattered more than hunger. No, it sells the clean story, the myth with the rough edges sanded down until it fits in a brochure. And then, around the turn of the millennium, something happens that would have seemed insane to a 19th century trail boss. The ranch's name leaves the ranch. Picture a conference room. Not brush and thorn, carpet, a long table polished until it reflects light like water, bottled water set in front of each chair like a small civilized offering, men and women in pressed shirts. Some have ranch dust in the creases of their hands, even if they've washed. Some have never smelled a branding fire in their lives. They all have pens. They all have notebooks. They speak in a language that turns culture into product. They are not negotiating grazing rights. They are negotiating identity. In 2000, Ford begins offering the King Ranch Edition trucks, vehicles wrapped in leather and emblem and implication, sold not as transportation, but as membership. The ranch's name, once burned into hide, is now stitched into seats and stamped into tailgates. The fence line has become a logo. The brand has become the ranch. And the ranch participates openly because participation is profit. It isn't even subtle. The ranch runs a working fleet of 260 Ford trucks, the kingdom on wheels, the myth made practical. The symbolism is almost too perfect. A ranch that once measured its power by how far a rider could travel in a day now measures part of its presence by how far a consumer can drive in comfort. Was this clever, or was it surrender dressed up as partnership? Because when you license your name, you're admitting something painful. The myth is worth more than the work. The work is hard and slow and full of costs. The myth is clean and portable. The myth sells in suburbs. The myth sells in cities. The myth sells to people who have never had to mend a fence in August heat or pull a calf in the mud at midnight. The myth makes them feel connected to something older and tougher than their life, and they pay for that feeling gladly. So the ranch lets them. It doesn't stop being a ranch, but it becomes something else at the same time. An American symbol factory, a private kingdom exporting its identity like a commodity because commodities survive where traditions die. And it doesn't end with trucks. A modern empire learns to diversify the way a cautious gambler learns to spread bets. The ranch's interests extend beyond the old South Texas brush into other kinds of agriculture, other kinds of land use, other kinds of revenue. There are holdings in Florida, 12,500 acres of sugar cane, because sugar, like oil, is an industrial crop with a global market and a different rhythm than cattle. A ranch that once measured wealth by how many heads survived the winter now measures wealth by acreage under cultivation, by leases, by partnerships, by deals that don't require a horse. And deals are where the old darkness finds new forms. Because the truth about a private kingdom is that power attracts power. People with influence like to gather in places where they can pretend they are simply enjoying nature. A hunt, a weekend retreat, a working visit. The language is always softer than the reality. And in those settings, behind gates, away from cameras, business and politics blur the way sweat blurs ink on a hot day. You don't have to imagine a smoky saloon in 1870 to see corruption. You just have to imagine a private dining room where the steak is perfect and the conversation is about access, about zoning, about tax treatment, about water, about what can be developed and what must remain conserved. The new frontier is not open range. It is legal advantage. And the ranch, old, practiced, patient, knows how to live in that world because it helped build that world. But reinvention has a cost that doesn't show up on balance sheets. It fractures the story. There are people, workers, neighbors, critics, who look at a King Ranch truck parked in a mall lot and feel something like nausea, because they know the logo is not just a logo. It is the visible face of an invisible system that kept families on the same land for generations without ever letting them truly own it. It is the polished mask over the old economy of labor and control. And there are people inside the ranch's orbit, heirs, executives, managers, who feel a different discomfort because they know the myth must be protected, and protecting it means choosing what to reveal and what to bury. It means celebrating the heritage while quietly managing the liabilities. It means praising the rugged individual while depending utterly on the invisible workforce. It means selling the image of freedom while operating a business that survives by tightening systems, tightening rules, tightening access. This is where the story turns from historical to human, because the King Ranch is not unique in its soul. It is simply large enough to see. It is America in miniature and in exaggeration at the same time. A place where land becomes power, where power becomes law, where law becomes marketing, where marketing becomes belief. And belief becomes an object you can purchase, drive, wear, and display. So what does it say about us, about the country that prides itself on liberty, that we keep building private kingdoms and then calling them heritage? And what does it say about the people who live in the shadow of those kingdoms, the ones who fix the fences, run the cattle, clear the brush, do the work that makes the myth possible, that their labor is often treated like scenery, while the brand gets celebrated like a hero? We started at a gate, a chain new and bright, a lock sitting in the sun like a small square of authority. Nothing about that gate is accidental. Gates are built because there is something worth keeping in and something worth keeping out. And the longer you stare at it, the more you understand that the gate is not just a piece of hardware. It is an idea. The idea that land, vast enough to feel like weather, can belong to a few. The idea that law will guard that belonging. The idea that the story of it can be sold, polished, exported, and repeated until the public forgets what it cost. And you can stand there, smelling dust and sun-warmed grass, hearing the faint insect hum and the distant lowing of cattle, and you can feel the old American bargain still humming in the metal of the chain. We will let certain people build kingdoms as long as they teach us to love the legend. So when you see the emblem on a truck seat, when you hear the ranch named like a prayer in advertising, when you feel that romantic tug toward the idea of open land and rugged lives, ask yourself what you are really buying. Are you buying heritage, or are you buying the right to look away from the lock?